Veronica Guerin started out as an accountant, drifted into politics and public relations, and then in her 30s landed a job at the Sunday Independent, one of the country's largest newspapers. For 2 years, she captivated Ireland with her exposés of Dublin's criminal underworld and the violent rise of some very powerful drug dealers. Then last June, she was murdered, gunned down in broad daylight, almost certainly by one of the people she was reporting on. Her death has become a national obsession. The first radio bulletins were sketchy, saying only that someone in a red sports car had been murdered execution style at a major intersection outside Dublin. But the police and the reporters on the scene knew the victim's identity. They just didn't want to believe it. When news spread that it was Veronica Guerin, in some mysterious way it touched the Irish soul. People left flowers and cards at government buildings, and at offices and factories around the country, there was a national moment of silence. Thousands of people attended the funeral, including the president and the prime minister, and the country wept when her 6-year-old son, Cathal, kissed his mother's casket in a final goodbye.
Everybody read Veronica Guerin. Everybody throughout the length and breadth of Ireland who wanted to know what was happening went to the Veronica Guerin column because it was undiluted.
Chris Finnegan is a retired narcotics detective who is one of Veronica Guerin's sources.
Was there anything that set her apart from other reporters?
Yes, I think there was. The way in which she came with the story. I think she had it very often, perhaps before the police had it, let alone before her peers or her colleagues would have had it.
And the stories she wrote took her readers into an Ireland very few people ever saw, away from the peaceful streets of a tranquil country into an underworld of drugs and organized crime. Inner-city neighborhoods had become infested with heroin. There were 8,000 addicts in Dublin alone.
Bingo!
Angel dust, ecstasy, and marijuana were finding their way into middle-class neighborhoods. There were a dozen gangland murders.
This is the latest in a series of brutal murders in Dublin.
Connolly's murder brings
yet another so-called gangland killing.
Been shot in the head.
Not one of them was ever solved. The Irish police didn't have the men or the money to do the job. It was as if no one cared except for Veronica Guerin, who spoke out frequently on Irish television.
I think that the dogs in the street know who the drug barons are. Everything favours the criminal in this society.
Lise Hand was a colleague of Veronica's and one of her closest friends.
She couldn't understand the fact that there was drug barons basically living in the midst of ordinary people and somehow seemingly invisible, and she wanted to fill them in, put colour on them, put faces on them, names, just bring them in, out into the light.
And she did. Using her background in business and accounting, she tracked the money. Her stories identified major organized crime figures and detailed their activities. And she was the first to seek out underworld bosses like John Traynor for interviews. To get around Ireland's restrictive libel laws, she used colorful nicknames like the Coach, the General, and the Monk.
We're publicising matters and bringing to the attention of the public generally a culture that exists in our society that nobody knows anything about. Now, if we publicise it and highlight it, politicians are forced to address these issues.
And after a while, it worked. The gangsters finally had someone to fear. In the fall of 1994, gunshots were fired through the front window of her house. It didn't stop her. A few months after the warning shots, a gunman burst through the front door. She described what happened next in a television interview.
The first thought that went through my head was, they meant it. And I thought, my God, I'm going to be killed.
The assailant pushed her up against a wall and put the gun to her head, then moved it slowly down to her thigh and pulled the trigger.
I could hear the gunman's footsteps running out of the house, and I was just banging my head off the floor saying, Christ, I'm alive, I'm alive.
The bullet just missed severing an artery. Her husband, Graham Turley, rushed with their son to the hospital.
I remember getting into the door of the hospital and going into the X-ray department and just seeing her there, and she was talking away as if as if she had a headache type of thing, you know. That was Veronica, you know.
As soon as she got out of the hospital and still on crutches, she got her husband to drive her around to the homes of major criminals just to show them she wasn't afraid. Her newspaper spent thousands of dollars on a security system for her home, and for a while she was given around-the-clock police protection until she called it off because it was interfering with her work, which more and more seemed to involve this man, John Gilligan, a nasty thug and suspected drug trafficker who, in the few years he had been out of prison, had managed to build a multi-million-dollar estate and equestrian center in the Irish countryside. In September of 1995, she paid Gilligan a visit and was unprepared for his response.
She said he just came out at her and he started beating and punching her and swearing at her.
Paul Williams, a crime reporter for Dublin's Sunday World newspaper, was Guerin's competitor and friend.
There was so much venom in his voice that it scared her. And he punched her, and he hit her very hard. He scared the living daylights out of her. She was on her own. And she said afterwards, she said, I shouldn't have gone out there, I know that.
According to a statement Guerin gave the police, her attacker called the very next day to make sure she'd gotten the message. If she wrote about him, he told her, I'm going to kidnap your son and sodomize him. I'm going to shoot you. Do you understand? I'm going to kill you. If anything, the threats made her more determined to carry out her work. In December of 1995, she was center stage in the world of journalism. She came to New York City to collect a prestigious award from the Committee to Protect Journalists. But not even the international attention made her life any safer. A few months later, John Gilligan and his entourage were frolicking in the Caribbean, where one of their associates made this videotape. They drank and danced and played in a private pool, and they taunted Veronica Guerin.
Here's Veronica Guerin.
Every time we would write about the fact that these guys were getting more dangerous, more sinister, more prepared to blow anybody away who tried to stop them or tried to expose them. We were laughed at. It was the hyperbole of the Sunday World or the Sunday Independent.
Who was laughing at you?
Politicians, other newspaper people who were basically hadn't a bottle to do what we were doing, hadn't the guts. Senior police officers, particularly police management.
You're blowing the problem way out of proportion.
Oh, absolutely.
In the end, it took Veronica Guerin's own murder last June 26th to convince people that everything she'd been writing about the criminal underworld was true.
About 1 o'clock in the afternoon, she stopped for a traffic light at this busy intersection on the outskirts of Dublin. She was being followed by two men on a motorcycle. According to several witnesses, the motorcycle pulled alongside her car. The passenger on the back jumped off, walked over and fired 5 shots through the window. Veronica Guerin was killed instantly. The gunman jumped back on his motorbike and disappeared in the midday traffic.
And I know for a fact that in the moments before Veronica was murdered, she actually said something to one of the guys, because I know that the scumbags who murdered her actually bragged about it to each other afterwards.
So you think that she saw this coming?
Oh, she saw him. She looked at him.
Can you tell me what she said to them? Do you know?
It's very upsetting for the people whoever, you know, the family, I don't think know this, but she said, don't shoot me in the face. And they didn't shoot her in the face. Because the guy on the bike, who rode the bike, talked about it afterwards. You know.
It's impossible to know right now whether that story is true, but it will no doubt become part of Veronica's legend. It's also impossible to know exactly why she continued to pursue the story in the face of such danger. Was she simply naive? Did she allow ambition and the thrill of a good story to cloud her judgment? Willie Keeley was her editor.
You never went up to her and said, Veronica, I think you're going too far. This is too dangerous. I think you should stop.
No. I never said you should stop writing about crime.
Would she have listened to you if you had said, Veronica, I think this is too dangerous. I think you should find another line of work, another beat?
Well, if the Sunday Independent had said, you cannot write about crime anymore, she would simply have gone somewhere else.
And Veronica Guerin confirmed as much in this interview 6 months before she was killed.
Before I ever got into investigating the criminal underworld in Dublin, if I said, okay, over the next 12, 18, 24 months, you are going to have shots fired into your house, be shot yourself, and be severely assaulted, and that your family are going to be threatened and intimidated. Am I going to get into it? No. I would never have got into it, but having got into it, I cannot walk away from it, because it's a job that must be done, and I'm a journalist.
Whoever killed Veronica Guerin must have felt that they were solving a problem, but in fact their problems were just beginning. And whatever trouble she caused them while she was alive is nothing compared to the trouble Veronica Guerin has caused them in death. The Irish Parliament convened a special session to pass emergency anti-crime legislation, and the Irish police began one of the biggest criminal investigations in the nation's history.
Since the murder, police have brought in more than 130 people for questioning. They've seized tens of millions of dollars worth of cocaine, heroin, and other drugs. They've confiscated 100 guns, many of which have been linked to other crimes.
Does the police know who killed her?
Mm-hmm.
They know who was driving the motorbike?
Yeah.
Who pulled the trigger?
Yeah.
Who ordered it?
Yeah. And all the other guys were involved in the logistical supply of the weapon, where the weapon came from. This has been a very meticulous investigation.
Whether the authorities will be able to prove their suspicions in court is another matter. So far, only one person has been charged, Paul Ward, an associate of John Gilligan, who was on that Caribbean vacation last spring. Another man on the trip is suspected of driving the motorcycle that carried the assassin. John Gilligan has not been charged in the murder case, although he's acknowledged he is the prime suspect. Since October, he's been locked up in an English prison awaiting trial on money laundering charges. Irish police recently raided his equestrian center and seized many of his assets, an action made possible through tough new laws passed as a result of Veronica Guerin's death, laws she had always said were necessary to go after the crime bosses. But maybe the most dramatic evidence of change can be seen at least once a week in the streets of Dublin.
What do we want? Push it out! When do we want it? Now!
There have been anti-drug marches before, but now people come by the hundreds and on some nights by the thousands. Adults and children, ordinary people, activists and politicians, marching through poor inner-city neighborhoods, surrounding the homes of suspected drug dealers and ordering them to leave.
The reason why we're here is because a fella called Michael Cronin lives here. He's a scumbag. He's a drug dealer.
It's been going on week after week, month after month since Veronica Guerin was murdered. Tony Gregory, a member of the Irish Parliament, says it's as if the entire country has picked up the crusade that Veronica Guerin started.
And it took the murder of a journalist to get the state to act against the drug barons.
What we're seeing here at the moment is probably one of the most dramatic periods in Irish criminal history. The criminals are on the run, big time. And literally, gangland has become a very quiet place, suddenly.